Hello, hello. Ma lo le tai au manuia, le tai au manino. No mai, haere mai, a fio mai susu mai, to the Tautai fali. We wanted to fulfill our fala and fill our mat, extend our mat, so we can talanua as ainga, as family. So firstly, on behalf of our ainga, we wanted to welcome and also offer our warmest congratulations to our special guest, Dr Rochelle Nafatali, on her recent graduation last week. Manuia lava le malanga manuia, ma lo le tamawhai le tauiwi. So Rochelle's also been acknowledged as the first Pacific Doctor of Clinical Psychology at Massey. So while I'm talking about Massey, my big shout outs are to our year 1 and 2 studiers who have finished for the year. Well done everyone for getting your waka to the end to reach the shore this year. So Dr Nafatali's research is around answering how, and I've just taken this straight from her bio, she answers how the conditions of the mind have come to be so stigmatized within Pacific society and how that can be changed through advocacy, acceptance of neurodiversity, and educating others. She adds that doing this with alofa, love and compassion, done through relationships and existing connections, which are critical. So I guess as part of the RTLB service, as part of the network that services our Pacific communities, she's basically going to tell us how we can be helpful, especially in terms of supporting our ainga, whether they're diagnosed, whether they're thinking about it, whether their teachers kind of pushing for it. How can we as RTLB be in a better position to support our Pacific families? So I'm just going to finish off with one of her quotes. People want to know how to be more inclusive and accommodating of neurodiversity and how to work effectively for Pacific communities. And I would say that would be why we're all here, sitting on the fala, to hear from the wisdom, to hear from the many voices that have contributed to Rochelle's research. So those voices are actually telling us what needs to happen for Pacific Ainga. So I'm going to hand it over to Rochelle to take us through her journey and also share the wisdom from the gold she has gathered from our communities. So over to you, Rochelle.
Can I just get a raised hand so you can see the presentation? All good? Okay. So malo lava le soifua maua ma le langi mama e mua ona o si ili bi inga ma le whakaitai le atua mo mātou mawhutanga le nei. Whakaitai fo'i I lau sasunga Brian le lua, whape fo'i ben a whele ma lia tuala mo le avanoa. O lo ingoa o Rochelle Nafatali, sa au whanau I nei I New Zealand, a o le mātou a inga e o mai le lua nuu o lua tua nuu ma laulii I Upolu Samoa. So I'm Rochelle, born just down the road from some of you in Otahuhu, South Auckland, but raised in Taitokido, the Bay of Islands. So I've been a member of the Pacifica Autism Support Group since our son was diagnosed as autistic and with global developmental delay. So since he was 5 in 2014. So as a parent and Pacific researcher, when I surveyed the literature that was out there about autism, there was no published peer-reviewed research on Pacific experiences of autism or of raising autistic children. And so the primary aims of this study were to gather the voices of Pacific families of autistic children, for the families to be able to see themselves, ourselves, and to amplify those voices to stakeholders with the goal of indirectly affecting outcomes for our children and ainga. The way I went about that needed to be authentically Pacific, as I'm on my own journey of discovering kind of my Pacific identity, and it needed to contribute to the appropriate valuing of Pacific and Indigenous languages and knowledges. But I mention a few caveats now. I do not attempt to convey the experience of being autistic, as I am not diagnosed autistic. I will present partly from a Samoan worldview, but even within the Samoan community, our beliefs vary, as you all know. So I don't speak on behalf of all Pacific families, nor of all families who have autistic children, but I do have lived experience of raising one Pacific autistic young person in Aotearoa, and I've been very privileged through this research to talanoa with other Pacific parents and families of autistic children. So some of what we came up with together was shared in the thesis, that the title there on screen, E le mai o le malosi. I'm also a registered clinical psychologist, and so I plan to share with you over this session the findings as they relate to health professionals, but with a tweak. I've tried to make this more applicable to the RTLB cluster and Tautai Plus. And so I hope that these things will resonate with those who are neurodiverse in the room or parents of neurodiverse children, and that they will also be helpful for you as professionals. So these are the experiences of 8 Pacific Auckland families who together we have 25 children, 13 of whom are autistic, and at the time the children were aged between 2 years and 17 years old, and the data was collected during early COVID in 2020. Just waiting for that to move on. Okay. So just very briefly, this is where my Samoan family come from in Samoa, about half an hour out of Apia. Lauli'i is apparently a surfing village, and so Luatuna is right next to that. And so just up on screen there, we have 5 generations from my great-grandparents who migrated here in in the 1950s. My nana came in 1951, and then my parents, myself, and my children there, Israel and Ramaya, on the right-hand side. So we're very proud of our Samoan heritage. So this is my son, Israel. He's now 14 and attending college, and breaking just about every kind of expectation that we could hold for him. He's very adaptable, very affectionate, very knowledgeable, and has an amazing memory. And he's just a huge blessing to our family. But as parents of a young autistic child, our first child, it was very difficult for us to know what that was and how to help our son. So it has been a journey. I just want to shout out to Brian and Betty Pulefolo and their beautiful family from Papakura. So they started in 2011, the Pacifica Autism Support Group, which started in Opulangi, but now has chapters in Wellington and Christchurch, and a big online following from families across Oceania who have an autistic family member who they're supporting. So this is a group, pardon me, that if you weren't aware of, you're certainly able to share this with families who you work with, because even if they're not in those main centres, there is support available online. And Brian and Betty started the group when their son Roman, who was 4 at the time, was diagnosed autistic, and they found that when they looked around, there was nothing for Pacific families, no specific support that they felt comfortable to go and attend. And so they thought, well, we'll just have to do it ourselves and take everyone along with us. And that's the Pacific way. So yeah, big shout out to them. Okay, so there is quite a lot of information out there about autism as perhaps a neurodevelopmental condition. There are other words used around it, like a disorder perhaps, or certainly a difference. And so the way that I like to come towards it is that autism is a condition, or it's a different brain really. It's part of neurodiversity, and it leads to differences in the following areas that you can see on screen. So it leads to differences in the way that our children relate to other people, in the way that they communicate, in the way that they experience the world coming in, so that sensory perception, their social skills, they may have different behaviours, and the way that they learn as well, which is important for us today. So some ways in which those differences might come about, or you may see them, is that some children will prefer their own or adult company rather than the company of their peers and their same age children. They may show affection differently, which might be they don't like to be touched or hugged, right through to seeking touch and hug. So there's quite a range there. The way that they communicate can often be different. So there is, again, a range from those who are non-speaking all the way through to those who are fluent, and everything in between. So we have children who use sign language, who would lead you by the hand to show you what they want, and you may have seen this in your classrooms. The use of augmented technology to communicate. They sometimes what they call pronomial reversal. So they will reverse the mine, yours pronouns. So they'll use yours for themselves and mine for when they're signifying something belongs to you. Echolalia is the repetition of words, sounds, or scripts back again. So it's like using your memory back again. And that can be a form of communication as well, depending on what the words are saying and the expression of the words. They may be using that as communication. Some of our children, many of our children have language delays, and many of them catch up as well later on. But initially, language delay is often one of the first signs that something needs a little bit more assessment. Some of our children have accents, and you may have heard in the classroom some American accents, perhaps. We believe this is related to, they're very reinforced by shows and movies and things that they're interested in. And so if they're listening to these shows, which often come from America, they will pick up that intonation and that expression. But that does fall away as they get older. And they have many more language models in their environment. Some children can be overly formal, so they'll be very polite and use very kind of adult language. And then there are differences in vocabulary, the tone of their voice, the way that they use nonverbal communication. Often they will have less gesturing. Some children will not be able to follow a point or point themselves, and so that's something to look out for. And then, of course, we have children who are fluent, and there'll be a difference in response to name across the children as well. So around, I think it is less than a third of all autistic children will be non-speaking. And we use the term non-speaking rather than non-verbal because they can use words in other ways. They can read words. Some have words, they're just not fluent. And they can also understand words that are spoken. So it's not completely correct to say non-verbal. Yeah, in terms of sensory perception, our kids have a range of kind of differences in the way that they experience the world. So some things may be overwhelming to them that aren't to, say, us, and that could be textures, sounds, scents, their eye contact ability, even colours can be overwhelming, the taste or the touch or the texture of food, and that whether they like pressure on their body or not, whether they appreciate darkness or light, and differences in personal touch and the way that things touch them as well. So they can be heightened sensitivity, or they can be seeking that to make them feel good. In terms of social skills, there's a range of differences in the understanding of social rules, so the things that kind of govern our behaviour, and sometimes those social etiquette or social rules and norms, they don't come naturally to our autistic kids. They have to work really hard to learn them. Whereas we pick them up as a process of osmosis and we don't think about it. They really have to think about it, and it takes a lot of energy for them to participate in these kind of protocols that we take for granted. And so because of that, many of our kids will experience anxiety being in social situations because they want to do the right thing, they want to learn. And there may be a reduced kind of reciprocity of those social interactions because it is quite taxing. In terms of behaviour, you may have seen some of our children line up or categorise their toys by colour or some other thing that only they know. They may use toys in different ways than what would be considered to be the way to play with that toy. They may peer really closely at the parts of the toy, say wheels, for example. They may engage in repetitive self-stimulating behaviours or stimming, and that could include toe walking, flappy hands, happy clapping, flicking of fingers, running, jumping, repeating sounds. They may have their own little rituals that they need to carry out. They may count to make them feel better, and having routine is very important for a lot of our children. So if there are changes in routine, they can get upset because it's like the unpredictability of it. It makes them concerned. And then in terms of learning, often our children are very visual learners. They can also be auditory learners, and that means that they can learn by music or hearing, and they don't necessarily have to be looking at you to be learning. So that's important to recognise. Kinesthetic as well, so really good in learning through movement and dance.
And then you have to go.
Sorry, Rochelle. I'm just going to ask everyone to mute their mics.
Yeah, thank you. And often, as I mentioned, they can have incredible autobiographical memories, so their rote learning capacity can be huge. But often they may need only one-step instruction, so just one step at a time. Often it can be very helpful to use a first-then board. So first we do this activity, then we get to do that activity, and so that gives them that sense of what's coming next. So it brings down the anxiety and also gives them a plan to follow. There can be co-occurring intellectual disability, although this is much less common in our children than previously thought. So typically those who have at least one expressive language word will have kind of at least average IQ ability. And then they can also have focused or special interests, so things that they know a lot about in one kind of area or some areas, and that interest may change over their age. So lots of things there you've probably seen before and go, oh yes, so that's what that is. Yeah, so that's the way that we kind of think about autism. So what autism is not is that it's not a behavioural issue. It's not the child being naughty. It is not a mental illness. Mental illnesses are, periods of distress or unwellness, whereas neurodiversity is a difference in the child's brain, and it is from, it's formed within the womb and lasts for life. So therefore, a lot of autistic people refer to their autism as part of their identity. So it's not something that can be grown out of or fixed or cured. It's not a conduct disorder. It's often misdiagnosed as conduct disorder because perhaps the child isn't seen to be listening or doing what it's asked, but it's not a conduct disorder. It's not just attention-seeking behaviour. It's not a consequence of bad parenting or a lack of discipline. It's not a curse, spirit, aitu, or demon. It's not the result of the parents or the child or anyone in the family having sinned or having not enough faith. And it's not a life sentence. It is a difference. Okay, so the way I like to think about it is that all brains are normal, and they're all kind of distributed along this this bell curve. And so we have lots and lots of people in the middle, and we have a few people on either end. And so either end would be those who are exceptionally able or gifted or even twice gifted. And then at the other end would be those who have an intellectual disability, who really might struggle. But everyone else in the middle, there is still this range of different brains. And so neurodiversity covers those who have ADHD, who are autistic, who have motor, communication, and behavioral differences. And so all of those brains think and use the world around them differently, but all of those brains are valued and are normal. What they're not, perhaps, is the most common, but that doesn't mean that they're abnormal. So if we consider brains in this way, so different brains, neurodiversity, then we can reconceptualize neurodiversity as being part of just normal variation and not as deficits or disorders that need to be prevented, fixed, or eradicated. We can recognize that what we call neurodevelopmental disorders can lead to disability for a neurodiverse person because of how the communities and the environments interact with that difference, and not arising from the brain or the person being different themselves. So this is often called the social model of disability, where it's not the disability that causes the problem, but it is a neurotypical world and the environments that we create not fitting or allowing that person to live easily. So that's when difficulties arise for neurodiverse people, when we try to squish neurodiverse brains, so different brains, into neurotypical boxes, or what everyone would say is normal, and try to make them more normal. That's when problems can arise. So just a couple of notes about terminology. So we wouldn't say that somebody suffers from autism, because as you can see on the graphic, that's so it's not necessarily something that an autistic person suffers with. It's part of their identity. They prefer not to use the word on the spectrum, because that might be like being on a skateboard. They're not a person with autism because they can't pick it up and put it down like a handbag. And it is part of their identity, so they would prefer to be called an autistic person. And some other terminology is that we talk about autism. I don't use the word autism spectrum disorder, and would say they are autistic or an autistic person. As I've mentioned before, non-speaking rather than non-verbal. And so the autistic community are those who are actually autistic, whereas the autism community are all of us, the supporters, the professionals, the family supporting that person. And rather than meltdown, we would say that the person is having sensory overwhelm or a sensory overload. And similarly with some symbols that have been used in the past for autism, the puzzle piece, it does the rounds just about every year, but this is not a symbol that the autistic community has chosen for themselves. It's one that's been put on them. And often autistic people see this as offensive because they're not puzzling or something that needs to be worked out. And so the actual official symbols for autism and for neurodiversity are the rainbow infinity symbol that you see there on the left and the gold infinity symbol, and they are preferred. So the aims of my particular research was to, because there was no Pacific research with autistic families, was firstly to understand how Pacific families understood autism. this huge label that's put on our children. And then how do we actually experience that on a day-to-day basis within our ainga and family? And then what supports were our families using, and what would we really like that isn't there? And finally, how do we maintain our language and culture given some of the communication challenges with autism? And so it's a very unique experience to raise an autistic child. And so therefore, parents hold a lot of expert knowledge on how autism impacts a family on a day-to-day basis. And as the primary carers of an autistic person, parents are often mediators, advocates for their child, the first teachers. They run their children around to all sorts of special appointments, as well as any medical or school appointments. There's a lot of kind of cognitive load included for those parents over and above what would be required for other similar aged children. And the supervision level is obviously higher as well. And you're not having that same kind of falling off of intense supervision and caring for the child. It often extends well into at least primary school, but likely college and after as well. And so our parents and our families really need support through that time. And so I was interested in like the intersection of culture with autism. So our differences in values, traditions, our socio-cultural and health experiences, so that I could then translate that to health professionals and try and come up with some things that would be helpful for our families. So the participants in the study, as I mentioned earlier, we had 8 Pacific families. They were from Aotearoa, Niue, Tongan, Samoan and Kiribati ethnicities, and we had a couple of Māori participants as well. And as I said, we had 25 children altogether. So this isn't including our family, so you could add another one in there. And then at the time there were 12 autistic children, and one was diagnosed, one more was diagnosed through the time of the study. So 13 out of 25 autistic children. The methodologies that I used in the study were based on Te Leva. That had to be the glue and the foundation for the whole research. And so that's partially the reason I decided to recruit from the Pasifika Autism Support Group, because there was established cultural and relational relationships there already. And it was a range of between not having met some parents through to being quite well acquainted with some parents and good friends. And so that impacted the collection of the data and the Pacific protocols that we used, and also the way that I interacted with the study participants right throughout the study and continue to do as well. I used Talanoa methodology from well, actually it was Konai Halu-Thaman that first kind of brought about Talanoa methodology, but Talanoa is used across the Pacific, and those who have written about it the most have been Violetti and more recently David Whaavai and Sione Waka. And then, so that was the way in which I collected the data and ran the Pacific protocols, and then I used the process of Pa'awhale Tui to weave together the data across all the families, find the similarities and the differences, and then present that back. And so I was kind of influenced by the idea of he awa whiria, so braided rivers, where you have both Indigenous and Western methodologies, and you're weaving them together at the same time. No methodology is higher or lesser than another, and they both bring out the best in the research and add to the project. And so I created what I've called the triple braided cord to signify that that's how the methodology was woven together. And so we come to Mika, who is the centerpiece of the research. He was a young Pacific boy of 8 years old at the time. He was a son of a participating family, and his story touched me so much that I thought, yes, this is a young boy who is very representative of our Pacific autistic community in Aotearoa, and who we could really, if Mika succeeds, all our children will succeed. And so I had a friend of mine who's a fantastic Samoan Pacific animator, Ali Cowley, create this image based on my recollection of Mika's story. And so you'll see there behind him, coming out as his superpower, is the neurodiversity rainbow infinity symbol, but with, of course, our Pacific patterns in there. And so I'll just read a little excerpt about Mika's story. So Mika, a young Aotearoa Pacific boy of 8 years old, loves to find out about the inside workings of things by opening them up and taking a good look. Others might call this destroying, but he has an inquiring mind. Mika also likes to take a stroll through his neighborhood to the shop. He knows exactly how to get there across many busy roads, as he has walked there many times with his family. Some might call this escaping, but he did not want to bother his family by asking them to take him, and everyone looked busy anyway. Mika is intimately connected with his extended family. His nana plaits his thick hair every morning before school, calming him with a lolly if he protests. Mika can verbalize, but he does not speak in the way that you would think of speaking to mean. Some would call him nonverbal, but this does not mean Mika has nothing to say, or that he does not have a wildly active thought life and imagination. At family and sporting events, Mika is often found communing with the birds. Some would say he was experiencing sensory overload, but Mika knows how to calm himself. He lifts his head to the sky to follow the pathway of the birds, the same pathway his ancestors took when they migrated to Aotearoa. He beckons to the tuli and toloa birds by patting on his chest. Although Mika does not speak, perhaps he is more connected to his ancestors than we know and realize. So Mika deserves to be supported to live a good life in Aotearoa as a fully engaged, fully participating Pacific young person with all the opportunities available to him, and to have his unique preferences and differences recognized and celebrated. To achieve this, Mika's parents need to be supported to support him throughout his childhood, and later for Mika to live interdependently according to his preferences and capabilities. And so often within our communities, there are some social issues or some challenges that we're coming up against. But there is a wonderful proverb from the Samoa that says, "E fo le ala mea." So the solutions to the problems that we face are found within our communities. And so with the alamea starfish, if you were to stand on the wrong side of that, its poisonous spines would get you. But the antidote to that is to flip it over on the other side, and that alamea would also then take back the poison that it's put into you. And so this is a metaphor for, as I said, the issues and challenges that we face, being able to be, we can find the solutions within our communities and to enable us to overcome those challenges. And so on the right-hand side there, I've got a Samoan compass, which is a traditional tool of navigation that has been developed from the knowledge that our ancestors would have used in oceanic migration hundreds of years ago. And so what it represents is the 7 star houses, and navigators would use the stars to navigate across huge expanses of ocean related to the constellations in the sky. And so these stars in the sky would set a pathway of light for the navigators to follow. And so you would cross from one star house, say Ngongo, on one side of the compass, and you would also travel across the ocean, and that star constellation would set in the house of Ngongo on the other side of the compass, so passing through the center point always. And this is how our navigators would find our islands. And so the reason I've brought these things up is this is how I've chosen to relate the findings, or to bring together the information from the parents together with our Indigenous knowledge to present the findings of the research. And then together with the term that has been used for Pacific disabled people, brought to us by the Tōwha Mamau Collective, Tangata Saili Malo, meaning Pacific disabled people, but also their families, carers and supporters. I've put all this together to create the tapasa a Tangata Saili Malo. And so this brings together the findings from the expert knowledge from our parents, together with Indigenous knowledge, to help our families see themselves, but also to help professionals working with our families understand what the family's experiences are and how they can help. And so the very first major theme that came out of the research is what I've called diasporic adaptation to neurodiversity. And I realize that this is a lot of big Balangi words, but I will explain it. So diaspora is in reference to our Pacific communities in Aotearoa, who are all diaspora of the Pacific, meaning that they are communities that have settled in Aotearoa, but whose home communities are back in the islands, whether that be Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, anywhere our Pacific people are coming from. We tend to have island communities back home as well. But in Aotearoa, we are settler communities who are adapting to the culture and the life and the language here in Aotearoa. So we're diaspora who are adapting. And then on top of that, our families who have neurodiverse children are adapting to a new way of parenting, a new way of understanding their children. And so there's like a double adaptation happening, where we're adapting to being Pacific in Aotearoa, and we're adapting to being parents of neurodiverse children and helping them on their way. And this came out very strongly across the research, that in order to be an effective parent to our neurodiverse children, we needed to change. We needed to adapt to them and to what was helpful for them. And if we didn't, it was very difficult for everybody. But when we did, that's when our families and our children were most successful. And so it was a realization that, yeah, you just have to change, and it's all good. So the first kind of sub-theme that I talked about with parents was I called Uncharted Islands, Understanding Autism, because none of our families, before the label was given to them, really understood what autism was. Autism as a term doesn't tell you what that is. It doesn't give you any information, and it wasn't as common in Pacific communities as it was in other communities at the time. And so our people have had a job trying to adapt and trying to understand what it is that we're dealing with. And so I talked about the Pacific conceptualization with parents. So what did you understand about autism before this label was given to you over your child? Or was there no idea at all? Like us, myself and Junior, we had never really even heard of this word. We had no idea what that was. And so we flew into a flurry of research to find out what this is and how to help our son. And so some of the reasons for that that not having that knowledge is because medical knowledge is socially constructed. So the things that we deal with, the conditions, the illness, the disabilities that we deal with in our societies The knowledge about that comes from having it in our society, needing to name it and needing to understand it. And so not having a huge amount of neurodevelopmental conditions within our Pacific communities means that it's just something that hasn't come up, that we haven't had to deal with before, and so it's very new. As well as that, our Pacific Indigenous conceptualizations, the way that we think about disability, health, illness, and mental distress are very different from Western conceptualizations. And so conditions are only named and become known as they grow in prevalence within the population. So, for example, most people would know about ma'iaitu because that was something that happened in our Pacific communities. So it's kind of spirit visitation or sickness from transgressions against aitu or spirits. And then ma'isuka is a more modern kind of condition, which we know to be diabetes. But these have developed because they came up and they were common. And so ma'i itself is kind of used as a Samoan term to mean any kind of illness or physical disability, and it extends to things like neurodevelopmental conditions because it is something that happens to a person. And so Vito Liamoa, an academic and a Catholic elder, she says that ma'i, as the Samoans understand it, is anything that alters and modifies the balance and the equilibrium of a person. That can come through the body, so through the physical body, through the spirit, through the mind, or the emotions. And so it happens from within or from outside the person, or both. And so that word ma'i then covers all conditions that can happen to a human. And so that's the closest kind of term that we have to autism at this point. And so if I just go back, usually ma'i would be used colloquially to mean anybody who is kind of sick or ill, or at the least somebody whose well-being is unbalanced. And traditionally, the causes of having illness or an unbalanced well-being was focused on what somebody had done or they hadn't done, divine curses or transgressions against the elementals, the Tene Sa, for example, and actions against community harmony. So they've sullied the va, they've broken some of those Pacific protocols that are really important in our communities, and that's led to these negative consequences and illness. And back in the day, pre-Christianity, there were 120 such spirits or pre-Christian gods that had to be appeased if you kind of crossed them. And so that would result in illness. And so it's important to realize that the stigma around conditions, around physical disability, around mental illness and conditions of the mind is related to this idea that you've done something to cause this, or you haven't done something to cause this. And so, of course, you're going to get, experiences of shame and of wanting to withdraw from people because they might blame you, of wanting to hide away because you've done something wrong. And it causes people to then isolate themselves. Okay. Oops. Yeah, and so I mentioned So McPherson did some wonderful research around this in the 1990s to say that, as I said, there were about 120 of these kind of early gods, and often when a god had been offended, a taulaitu or a healer or a spirit kind of medium would be consulted to act as the person going between the community and the aitu, to learn how that they could appease the aitu. So before Christianity, that's the way that we tended to think about illness and disability. And so Tuitea, who's a Pacific nurse, in her PhD stated that ma'iaitu has been clearly identified in the Samoan culture as a mental illness caused by spirits as a result of the breaking of traditional Samoan rules. And this is a well-known fact in philosophy. Then post-Christianity, we learned about, obviously, the Christian God Atua, about sin and about behaving in certain ways. And so that kind of, you kind of break a transgression against an early God, leading to sin and illness, now becomes, if you sin against the Christian God, that can bring curses or illness against you as well. And so Pacific peoples with more traditional beliefs still are thinking about kind of the aitu that were before, as well as the new Christian God. And so even though many modern parents so these beliefs are more common in those who are migrating directly from the islands still, or who are more traditional in their beliefs and views, and often Pacific Aotearoa parents who have been born here have different views. But the traditional communities that they interact with, say through church and other organisations, their older family members will still have beliefs that are related to these beliefs. And so the parents now, who are parents of autistic children, are still affected by those beliefs and judgments. And so generally our parents in our study describe the older beliefs as a lack of understanding of autism as a condition, because we haven't dealt with it growing up in our society. But then it has the solution of awareness, education, and improving that understanding. Okay, so just if people can kind of pop in the chat, what if you had these kind of beliefs that autism is something that is the consequence of either sin or of breaking some of those traditional customs or village kind of rules or protocols, or crossing the var in some way, what kinds of behaviors might you see from parents of autistic children who hold these beliefs? If you're seeing these children come through school and the parents have some of these beliefs, what might you see? And we'll just give a couple of minutes for people to answer that and have a chat about it.
There's a lot coming through the chat, Rochelle.
Okay, all right.
A lot of information there. I think there's also a lot of positivity with what you're sharing is actually quite important. And some of them actually didn't realize the word mai in Samoan culture generally covered everything. I don't know if there is actually a word out there in terms of Pacific Collective of a word that means autism. Is there?
That's correct. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more next. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
Thanks for that. And you're doing amazing.
I have to say, just a little time check. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So our parents will be experiencing blame, judgment from others, isolating from your family, isolating your child from your community. Absolutely. You'd hide away, a lot of shame, disengagement, denial. Yes, absolutely. Not willing to share about their experiences. Yes, denial, anger, confusion, absolutely. Taking children to prayer groups to be prayed over, yes, absolutely. Yes, and some would engage in punishment and thinking that punitive solutions will help, yes. Yep, parents are bewildered, isolated, and afraid to reach out for help. Absolutely. Wanting support to fix the problem so they can go back to being, quote, normal. Yes. Finding it hard to communicate as they feel responsible, but also they don't know what's going on. Guilt, absolutely. Needing to be healed, withdrawal, guilt. Yes, so absolutely, you're all absolutely correct. And so, and engaging in traditional healing, so such as for, yeah, absolutely. Yes, so isolating, not attending church, yeah, perhaps even being mocked, certainly feeling judged. Yeah, so thank you everyone for those. All of those are very correct, and all of those are what our parents experienced and spoke about as they came through the research. So let me carry on here. All right, so this fundamental tendency to understand psychological phenomena such as autism, different brains, neurodiversity, in terms of punishment and retribution leads to a lot of anxiety for our, particularly our Pacific elders, but also our parents who are trying to live right to avoid the negative consequences. And it has to be understood for its impact on Pacific people's reticence, so not wanting to attend health services due to that stigma and shame. So as you've all kind of pointed out, that's going to be huge for our families. And so of course there's going to be, you know, a lack of braveness in coming forward because of the concern about the stigma and shame that they might experience. So also our Pacific conceptualizations of child development are different to Western conceptualizations, and research with Samoan primary school principals has uncovered this kind of the model of learning within child development as wa'ai whaalongo matautala. So we're seeing and observing, we're listening and hearing, and then that ends up in our ability to be able to express and talk about what we've seen and learnt. So considering that that is the model for understanding child development, successful child development, what happens to the way of thinking about somebody's development if that child can't talk? If that's the assessment variable, the outcome variable, being able to talk, and our children don't talk, how's that going to impact on our children and our families? And often that is seen as a fault of the family or the parents because the child can't or won't talk. So as Ben shared, there is no term for autism. The closest we currently have is ma'i, but this doesn't really speak to what our children are experiencing. And so one of the fathers in our study, he was talking with his parents and he was very hurt by the fact that they were using the word ma'i to describe his son. And so he taught them in a beautiful kind of example that through alofa you can actually change hearts and minds. And since they had this talanoa together, the parents never used that word ma'i again because it didn't fit with what they saw of their beautiful grandson. And Salote said, you know, there were words such as ma'i ole mawhawhau to describe autism because there wasn't another word. But she said, you know, that sounds like brain damage to me, and that's not what their son was presenting with, so it didn't fit. And so not having words makes it very difficult for parents to hold on to and accept that diagnosis and to understand what to do with it. And some of the Pacific conceptualizations that the parents thought of were that the autism is a mental illness, that it's a curse that's been brought down generations of family, that it was a spiritual kind of consequence, that it was just a physical sickness, because that's what ma'i is often. And so, yeah, as I've said, consequence of sin or wrongdoing, bad parenting, the child doesn't know how to act properly. It's a lack of discipline or spoiling the child. This child is naughty and it needs to be sassed or fussied. And the family is not devout enough in their faith. And so there was a term back in 2012 published by the Ministry of Health for autism, and it was amionga e mafua o le mai o le mawhauwhau. But that term is not well recognised or understood, and as I said, it doesn't quite fit, so it hasn't been taken up. The Māori term for autism is takiwātanga, and this was developed around 2017 by linguist and health professional Kiri Opai. And this is a beautiful term because it comes from the Māori conceptualization of what autism is. It's not a direct translation of the word autism. And so it is taken from a whakatauki, a proverb that speaks about the titoki tree, which blooms irregularly in its own time when it wants to. And so the term for autism, takiwātanga, is somebody who is acting in their own time and space. And so that acknowledges that different life rhythm, that's not lesser, it's just different, and it speaks to the strength of autistic people rather than a deficit. And other conceptualizations that have been found in Te Ao Māori are talking about how when the young child, the toddler, still has a soft head, and it's, you know, the time to be very careful around the child's head is when the baby's fontanella hasn't closed yet. And the way that this is conceptualized is that the child is still receiving their gifts from Te Atua, and so that fontanella hasn't closed yet. So some of these beautiful conceptualizations we can also bounce off to create our own term for autism that people will be able to resonate with. So I'm just going to skip through a little bit. So one of the questions, one of the whisili that was important for today was, what is the difference between Pacific and non-Pacific autistic children? And you'll likely be wondering this with the children coming through your classrooms. And I would say in terms of being autistic and being a child, there is no kind of differences necessarily in the way that autism comes out in our children. So being in the diagnostic clinic in the super clinic in Manukau, the children who are coming through were of various ethnicities, Indian, all types of Pacific ethnicities, Balangi, Māori. They all had very similar presentations of their autistic traits and symptoms. But what might be different is the environments around the child. So in our Pacific environments, we might have a larger extended family structure, and we might have generations living in the house, which provides so many more cultural and language rich learning environments for the child. And that leads to more opportunity in the way that we can support them. They may just have different sensory likes and dislikes. So one of our families, their child didn't like kokolaisa or niu, and so the child was, it was said about the child that they weren't Samoan because they didn't like kokolaisa and niu, but that was a sensory thing. They just didn't like the texture of it. And so, yeah, some of the comments that can come from family members who don't understand autism as a different way of experiencing textures and foods and things like that. And the subject of their special interest might be different. So it might have a cultural flavour to it because of their experiences in their world. But in terms of the behaviours and the things that are coming through that we can diagnose, they tend to be very, very similar, and it's amazing how similar they are across ethnicities. There are a lot of reactions to diagnosis that parents go through. Many parents grieve. Dads adjust at different times to mums, and they experience more denial and for longer. And so it's really important for us to try to take our dads along with us on the journey, have them at the assessment appointments so that they can adjust in their own time, but that they have all the opportunity to do that. because it's so much better for the parents and the child to have the parents on the same page together, and then everyone can go forward together. And so when acceptance does happen, this leads to more sensitive and adaptive parenting of the autistic child and a greater understanding of the child's behaviour. And so one of the parents would say, you know, once you get over it, then you can move forward, and everyone is better off for that. One thing we certainly learnt was that the way that parents experience the referral and diagnosis process going through the assessment, that directly affected how they accepted the diagnosis and how they went on to seek support. And if it was a horrible experience going through referral and diagnosis, then that acceptance and seeking support journey was really, really difficult. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of fear, worries about judgment, worries about bullying, a lot of worries from our family initially. In terms of language, often health professionals advise our families not to confuse the child by trying to learn both our Pacific heritage languages and English, and just to focus on the English. But I'm here to tell you that there is at least 40 years of evidence in the literature around children with neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism, that they have similar language capacities and capabilities to their similar age peers, as long as they have that expressive language. But they can also understand language even if they're non-speaking. And the children know that it's a different language and they're stored in a different part of the brain, so you're not going to confuse them. They're very astute at, you know, understanding when a different language is spoken and who you should speak that different language to. And it is actually all the better to immerse your children in as many language experiences as you can, and to speak more to them, even though they may be non-speaking or have less words. The more language you can surround your child with, immerse your child in, the better for them. And children who have even just one word that they speak have much better outcomes in their future than those who are not able to speak. So the more support you can put around that language and the more language that they're exposed to is better for them. And so the parents had a range of experiences with their own heritage Pacific language, and often in Aotearoa we had a loss of language in, say, my generation and the generation higher, but then my generation were very keen to get back to that language and to have their children immersed in it as well. And just very quickly, for our son Israel, we put him in aonga mata as soon as he was able to go, and it was actually the aonga mata who raised concerns about his behaviour and his language delay, and that's how we ended up having him assessed. And he had to leave aonga mata because unfortunately they didn't have the resource to be able to support him and help him. And that was devastating for me particularly. My husband's fluent in Samoan, but I came to begin to learn the language at university. So I was devastated that Israel might not learn his language. But what we did was we put him in a mainstream ECE, and he went through there, and he learned his English because that's the advice that we were given. And then later on, he's been exposed to Samoan, and just recently he's participated in an anganu'u day for our family, where he actually gave a little laonga, and he called everybody to the table for the meal, and it was just amazing. But you know, there was a time where we didn't think that he would speak at all when he was a toddler, and so he's had a huge language progression, and it was because of all the language rich opportunities that were given to him, and because he's so amazing to take those up. In terms of culture, culture was very important to our parents as well. So they wanted to have culture imbued in their child's learning, their child's life. There were different kind of ideas about, well, actually whānau ainga, that is culture and language, it's all wrapped up in one. Other parents thought that to have their children surrounded by language and dance was amazing for their cultural development. And most parents wanted their children to know the cultural protocols and to know what to do when you go to see the family. So they were very keen for all of that to be included. One big part of our study was how parents needed to unlearn what they had learned growing up in their own experiences with their parents and their kind of parenting ideals that they came to parenting with. They had to just get rid of all that and kind of learn again, start again, and do what the child needed them to do. And that takes humility. And it takes creativity as well. But for one instance, Pania here is talking about how they used Dora the Explorer, which their son loved. They used a little routine from Dora where everything is in threes. And so they had to sing the song, you know, and then the son got to watch a little bit of Dora. And that's how they got him to learn those routines that you have to do, like personal hygiene and all those things, through something that he loved. So through his passion, that's how they were able to teach him. And that won't be unfamiliar to all you guys who are educators and professionals, but that was something very new to a lot of our parents. Yeah. Okay, so we can just put in the chat again, so you can answer one of these questions, choose one of them. So how would you go about teaching a child, say, the alphabet, but you can only teach them through movement, so that kinesthetic kind of learning style? Or how would you teach your child manners or specific protocols around food and eating, but you're not allowed to use words, you can only use visuals? And then what if you needed to teach a child in your classroom the classroom routine, but you could only do it through song? How would you go about this? And I'm just interested to see some thoughts. Yes, I love it. Making shapes with our bodies, song and dance, sign language, drawing in sand, beautiful. Yep, sign language, miming, yes, role play. Nursery rhyme, change the words, exactly. Yep, use a paintbrush, squirty water, using videos, very good. Yeah, absolutely. Drama, yes. Song and dance, absolutely. Hopscotch, fantastic. Singing, photographs, yes. Yeah, that modeling, so video modeling and people that the child relates to. So it could be a character that they watch in their shows, or it could be their family members. Very, very reinforcing for the child. So excellent ways of helping them learn. One way of teaching children how to tie their shoelaces, which can be a very, very tricky thing for some of our kids, is to have them do it on video successfully. So you're guiding the child and then they watch that when they're having trouble with it, and it's just a really, really good way of teaching quickly how to get over the tricky parts. ABCs, flashcards, use a phone or an app. Yeah, absolutely, fantastic. So the point of those questions really was just to show that you guys all have this knowledge, and you can think about how to teach our children in a different way. You already know that. So, you know, don't be afraid to kind of try new things And if it doesn't work, that's cool. Try another way. Nothing's wasted or, you know, a failure. You just try again a different way. But some of those strategies that you've outlined are perfect, beautiful.
Rochelle,
And
can
so,
I just ask a quick question?
yes,
It's just
sure.
a personal question, actually. Does the Pacific nations have their own sign language?
So there is a Samoan Makaton version that's been created in Aotearoa by one of our Samoan educators.
Okay.
I'm not aware of other Pacific forms of sign language, but there may very well be. There is definitely Te Reo sign.
Yeah, I just saw the sign language come up, and I was thinking whether there was a Pacific. Sorry.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there can be, but you can also create your own sign language and teach that if you aren't aware of other sign languages.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, so there is a hierarchy of learning, and I couldn't find the reference, but you guys probably know more about this than I do. But there's that hierarchy of learning where if you read something, yeah, you might remember it or not, but if you hear something, you're a lot more likely to remember it. If you hear something and watch it at the same time, that's even more. If you hear something, watch it, and you're actually involved in moving your body with that at the same time, that's even stronger. So when I used to study for my exams, I used to first, you know, read, take in the lectures by watching and hearing. Then I'd write practice essays, and then I'd write practice essays while speaking it and recording it, and then I'd listen to the recordings, and I could reel off that entire essay at the end of that process. And that's just because you're engaging all those different learning styles and different ways of learning. So the more you can get in an experience, the better that learning sticks, and for longer. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to bounce all the way to some of the implications, because that's why you're all here. But if there's lots more information in the thesis about what the parents experienced and what the families thought about lots of different issues. But I'm just going to concentrate on the questions and implications in our last minutes. So what are the best ways to support Pacific Ainga who firstly have a diagnosis already? So we can help by setting realistic goals together with the families for the child. And so you want to make these goals an extension from where they are right now. You want to give them a little bit of that proximal zone of development. You want to give them a little bit of stretch, but not too much. And then obviously you reassess that as they continue to grow. So establishing a team that's around the child with, you know, perhaps the classroom teacher, the RTLB, there might be an OT involved, early intervention teachers when they're transitioning into school, the SENCO, as well as the parent, any other professionals who might need to be there. And this probably already happens with IEPs, but not every child has an IEP. So even if they don't, this can happen. And set up that communication between home and school. So whether that's a notebook or an email trail or a chat or whatever it is, just open communication so that the professionals can give the family updates, the family can also give the professionals updates, and everybody's working on that progress for the child. So even if you're not involved in IEP meetings, you will have valuable information that will really help set those goals, update, and also encourage the families. So feel free to contribute updates to the parents or to the meetings, even if you're not attending. You can co-create resources for the child, whether that be laminated visuals, first then boards, visual core boards, you know, all that fun stuff. And you can be really creative with those and definitely bring our Pacific cultural motifs into there. So while you're getting to know the child's interests and motivators and the things that set them off, that upset them, explore with the family their cultural and language desires for the child, because you want to be guided by that. and share with the family that the child, just because they're autistic does not mean that they can't learn. It's that we need to find the way in which they best learn and play to their strengths. And so you can share with the family simple information like, yeah, absolutely, we don't want to put a ceiling on our children. We want to have high expectations, give them all the opportunities and see where they can go. So you can explore those the learning capacities together, and consider that the best environment for the child in school may actually be a bilingual unit, due to the holistic approach that bilingual units often have. They usually run from like a te whare tapawha or a Fono whare kind of model of health, that takes health and education, that takes into consideration all of our facets of wellness. And so even if the child is non-speaking, they will still benefit from that holistic collective environment, and often a more inclusive approach altogether, irrespective of what their expressive language capacity is. But even if they're non-speaking or have little language, you can bet that if they're in an environment like that, that is probably the biggest encourager for them to speak more, because they're feeling accepted, they're feeling loved, they're feeling supported in that environment, and they're seeing their peers use their own language. So why not? You can always change if it's not the right environment, but that may be the best environment. So how to help Pacific Ainga who know that their child is different. They may think that they're naughty, they may experience the child doesn't listen, or that the teacher or SENCO suggests that the child could be assessed. So I would say this is the time where you really try to come alongside the family, because we now know that they may be experiencing lots of beliefs and concerns about how autism comes about, and they may be feeling already either denial or scared of what might happen. And so they may not like the word assessment or concerns about their child's development, but you can really come alongside them, just be kind, but share information that you're seeing. So you can explain what you're seeing in the classroom and what might be considered where they should be for their age and stage, and if they're not meeting that, because those are facts. So I would definitely not go in and say, hey, I think your child's autistic, because we often don't know. There are often co-occurring conditions as well, and you just might be wrong, because not every child that lines up little toy cars is autistic. You can have sensory differences in a person who's not autistic. So you don't go in with the labels, but you can say, hey, look, this is what I'm seeing. Is this what you're seeing at home too? And like, how is it for you at dinner time with maybe they're not eating the food with all the family and you're worried about that? Or, do you have to watch them all the time? How are they with their siblings? And just kind of gather information in that way that's non-confrontational, that you're concerned about the family and the child, and explain that as they become more interested in assessment or how to help the child, you can explain that once there is a diagnosis, they're open to a lot more support, and the school is able to help the child a lot more as well. And you could name some of those resources if that's helpful. So teacher aids, OARS funding, extra RTLB time, ESOL if they need that, etc. And explain that often assessment rules out things as much as it confirms things. So it could be a way of saying, oh, well, it's not these things, and that may be comforting for them as well. And so also saying that, once you go through assessment and know what you're dealing with, things become a lot less stressful for the family. So what are some of the best ways that RTLBs can support the main classroom teacher? RTLBs might have capacity to engage positively with the family, particularly if you're the Pacific professional in the relationship. So you could help by creating a profile with the family of the child, so all their likes and dislikes, their interests, things like that on a big poster. Many of you probably already do this. Just know that parents often appreciate updates, even if it's like the little funny things that their child did throughout the day or the times where they were positive, because often our parents come to pick up the child at the end of the day and they get this huge, long speech about everything that their child did wrong that day. And it's not because the professional is being mean or anything. It's just because they want the parent to understand what's going on so it can be addressed. But just have some balance in that, like, oh yeah, they were fantastic at this, or they waited really beautifully at morning tea time, so that there's some positive as well as things to work on in there. And you can also offer the opportunity for the family to come in and explain their child's differences to the class, so that the class understand and everybody has that kind of tolerant, accepting attitude for the child. We can help the teacher to understand the child's world, because we might work with them more. Ask the family what the child is most engaged in at home, find out what routines and cultural protocols are part of the child's life. Play to those strengths, of course. Send home some laminated resources or a sensory item or a book, so that they can experience that at home as well, and the family can get to know what the child likes. Create resources for the teacher to use during those transition times, like visuals, and to signify routines like pack-up time. And yeah, just assist in creating that place of safety and belonging for the child. So within our modern learning environments, often there are lots of children, lots of stimulating sensory experiences, and it can be overwhelming for our child. So if there's not a quiet place that they can draw away to, perhaps some earphones or some little fidget toys could be helpful, so that they can calm themselves within that setting. So there's things that we can do there. And I would just say that ensure that the child's needs for support and accommodation are not endangering their privacy, their cultural practices, or their dignity. So if they need support with toileting and things like that, just be kind of mindful of how you remove the child to do that, and that other children aren't kind of watching, and be considerate of different genders interacting within our Pacific protocols. So as we've discussed, there's no Pacific term yet for autism, and so in the meantime we could use tangata asa ili malo to refer to somebody who has a disability until we create our own autism term. But the person who creates that term may very well be sitting in this group today. There's nothing to stop us from doing that. Don't feel like you have to have a PhD to do that. We just need somebody who can think about autism from a Pacific way, a strengths perspective, and then to bring about a term that we can all use, or many terms to acknowledge our many Pacific ethnicities. So I've talked about language and culture maintenance, so don't be afraid to suggest that the parents use their Pacific language at home. Bring that into school, bring all those beautiful, rich cultural experiences into school, because it's all good for our children and it's not going to hinder their English language abilities. We can also share with parents what kinds of support and funding is available. So I'll send out some links after this presentation, which you might be able to share with parents. Often the parents are not getting this information from the health professionals, and there are a lot of gatekeepers out there. So the more that we can upskill our parents, the more that they will be supported, and the less that they will stress out, and everyone will have better outcomes. And also just know that public health professionals, GPs and things like that, they often do not have training in neurodevelopmental conditions and autism. So they are also learning, and they don't necessarily know how to interact with a family and with an autistic child. So we can't kind of rely on them. We all need to upskill together. So I've mentioned inclusive education environments. So looking at the child's learning styles, considering what might be their most inclusive and supportive environment for that child, and supporting our children to reach their full potential all the way from ECE through to secondary and beyond, because the transition into adulthood is also very important. Recognise that our parents need social support, particularly if they don't have the extended village family communities available to them. And recognise that our parents who lack that support are at higher risk of burnout and mental health issues and relationship problems. So you might be able to have a little word to parents about, seeking somebody to look after the child, or perhaps engaging in those funding streams to get carers to help and things like that, just to take some of the pressure off, so that they can refresh and recharge and they can be a better parent to their child. And then also our parents need to accept the help that's offered. And so sometimes our parents might need to do that in a slow, graduated way. So maybe they accept just a little bit of help at first, and then when that goes well, they might be open to accepting a little bit more help. But remember that there's often those ideas that they want to isolate and withdraw. So we need to figure out how we can cross those barriers to avoid burnout and things like that. Okay, so some last messages. Pacific peoples, as we've discussed, are often coming to autism from a different perspective, and that is going to inform their experience of how they accept autism and how they go in seeking support. So autism touches every area of a family's life, and it impacts the whole family. And so that translates into the supports that the family may need to go forward together in a successful way. So we can help out with telling parents of some of those supports in our area, or some support groups, and we can encourage worried parents to get an assessment. If it is autism, the child's not going to grow out of it, and the sooner that the family gets support, the better for everyone. And also cultural competency and neurodiversity professional development is really important for all of us as professionals. And just because we're Pacific doesn't mean that we are effective with all Pacific communities. We need to get kind of cultural supervision if we're working with a family whose Pacific ethnicity is different to ours, and get that before you meet the family, so that you're not kind of, pronouncing the names wrong or anything, that you're starting off at a good place with this family. And then, just say that our autistic children, they grow into adults. So we need to think about how their journey is going to go forward, and are we setting them up to be able to learn for life and to have good self-determined lives according to what they're capable of and what they want for themselves. And our children are obviously a blessing, so enjoy them and celebrate all the small wins, because they're huge for our autistic children, remembering that they're not sick, they're strong. And so I just want to finish off by encouraging anyone who might be thinking of further postgrad study to absolutely go for that. We need as many of our Pacific professionals to take up those roles and to have decision-making kind of roles across our education system. And I'd also throw in a plug for psychology. As a health discipline, it is a growing area, but we need that Pacific input, that kind of holistic cultural view of health. Is missing, or has been missing for a long time, from psychology. So everything that you come with as a Pacific professional is so valuable, and I would just say, encourage you to, if you're thinking about study, absolutely get in and do it, because it's so valuable, and we need you out there. So just want to say thank you very much again for your time. Tautai, tele lava, thank you so much for working with our children, making the lives of our children better with everything that you do. I just want to honour your contribution. And if I'm sorry, I've gone over time, but I'm still happy to take questions, and also I'll be sending out a bunch of information later, and happy for people to respond to that with any further questions. So, tele lava mo le awanoa. Over to you guys.
Thank you, Rochelle. Listen, we do have some questions, but because of the time, I think your session has covered quite a lot, and it's covered not only your research, but also strategies for RTLB to implement with their casework, and also looking back on the key messages. I think you've covered quite a bit. There are a few questions here but Brian, do we have time to answer a few? Or shall we just, or Rochelle, would you be happy to answer those questions that if we email you those questions? We've just got it in the chat at the moment, and we've recorded the chat.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to see a recording of the chat, and very happy to get back to people as long as I have details. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think a lot of our colleagues here, those that are watching, are going to come back to this, because what you've shared is actually gold. And we've got the comments coming through, and they really appreciate what you've shared today. So I'm going to hand it over to Rose to give you a formal thanks for coming in and for sharing your mahi with us.
Not me, Malia, thank you.
Malia, sorry, Malia.
That's okay, Ben. Well, what can you say? Just want to say a big whawhiti tela lava to you, Dr Rochelle Nafatali, for sharing the pearls of wisdom that you've gathered from our people. Because these are certainly things that have expanded our knowledge and practice kete for the work in the field. And I think each of us have some small way of supporting a Pacific family that we know of, or some small way of supporting a teacher who has Pacific children. So just a big thank you from Tautai Plus. I'm just going to stop because I'm just about to choke up with coughing. But if you were here in person, we would have given you a beautiful ula. But you're not here in person, and I know Brian has a beautiful ula to give you, but instead we'd like to sing you the whawhiti song. So thank you, and wish you a really good Christmas with the whānau and ainga. And I'm sure we'll continue to do some kind of work in this field around Pacific autism, and maybe we will come up with a name that's going to be responsive to each of our Pacific nations. Okay, ready, team? Don't forget, we get to sing this. We've got to practice the song. We've got to get good at it because we've got to sing it all the time. Whawhawhitai, whawhawhitai, wamali mata e ai. Watasi lava oi, watasi lava oi, ilo une va amoe moi. Hey, hey!
Oh,
Yes. Thank you, Rochelle.
Tautai tele lava and manuia lava le aso. Yeah, tato uma. Thank you, and I'll leave you guys to continue with your Fono.
thank you, Rochelle.
Take care. Yeah,
Thank
manuia.
you.